So in this tutorial, we're going to look at an overview of global patterns and trends in the availability and consumption of food, including changing diets in middle-income countries. So the first thing that we see here is that in parts of Central Africa and Eastern Africa, there is insufficient availability of food. And across Sub-Saharan Africa, there are sufficient to insufficient levels of food. In the Northern Hemisphere, in North America, Europe, Eurasia, we see an abundance of food. Then we have to be a little bit careful when we look at maps like this, because sometimes food availability in a country doesn't always translate to food security or insecurity. So the reasons for food insecurity are often complex, and they're linked to systemic, social, economic, and political drivers in that country. So if we look at a map of food insecurity, this one coming from our World in Data, you can see that, actually there's a lot of data missing in this, which isn't helpful, but we do see that pattern in Eastern Africa. We do see actually a stronger pattern of food insecurity, though, in Southern Africa, which perhaps wasn't evident in the earlier map. On the whole, though, we see very, very low levels of food insecurity in North America and Europe, but it hasn't disappeared entirely. Look, when you think about population sizes and you think that 2.5% of them are insecure with food, you're getting a picture there of inequality in terms of access to food. And of course, food is very much available here. It's just out of the price range of people that live in these regions. There is a kind of a good news story when we look at this type of graph, because look at Sub-Saharan Africa and the huge quantities of available land that's there, half of which, close to 100 million hectares of land within just 6 hours of the marketplace. And so actually there's great potential there, untapped potential, I'd say. And so actually, in terms of future food production, there's a great opportunity for Africa to increase its food availability. We see a similar picture in Latin America and the Caribbean, and actually they're more favorable outlook in terms of the proximity to markets. And then when we look at kind of East and Southeast Asia, and to some extent Eastern Europe and Central Asia, you're seeing much lower levels of food available. We're almost maxing out our food production, certainly in East Asia. So we might be thinking here, well, what does calorie intake tell us about food availability? And it's a useful indicator. I mean, it does show here that there are very low levels of calorie intake, daily calorie intake in Sub-Saharan Africa. We saw a big problem of food insecurity, though, didn't we, in South Africa? And here there is higher calorie intake. So what's causing that? We've got quite high levels of calorie intake here in Argentina, but in an earlier map we saw quite high levels of food insecurity. So calorie intake is an interesting indicator. It tells us about quantities of food, but it doesn't really tell us anything about nutrition. But we do get a broad picture around the availability of food from that graph, that map. So when we think about changing diets within middle-income countries, there is significant change. I think this is an interesting model where countries in the developing world maybe are based around localized food, staple food. There's maybe a scarcity of food, certainly in rural areas, and food insecurity and hunger. And we can move, these countries develop, they move towards kind of overconsumption of food. And this is where we might find maybe some high-income countries and to some extent some parts of the population in middle-income countries. And then perhaps we can move towards more healthy and sustainable diets. So there is this transition when we think about food. And this graphic is quite interesting because it shows the change in diets over quite an extended period of time. So in particular, if we're interested in looking at these regions, like Sub-Saharan Africa, there does seem to be very little change in terms of their diets here, looking at the two graphs. No significant change in their diets. But when we look at some of these other regions, so Near East and North Africa, there is a significant change. There's an increase here in roots and tubers. there's also an increase here in meat consumption and dairy products. In Latin America, we see that same increase here in meat consumption, and we see that fall in roots and tubers. So real changes in diets with more animal products coming in. South Asia, again, more animal products, not meat so much this time, but milk and dairy products increasing in quantities. And in East Asia, we see that significant fall, look, in roots and tubers, and actually in cereals too, and an increase in meat consumption being very, very dominant. Look at the increase in dairy products in East Asia as well. So real increases there in animal products. So there's a change in processed food here, food retail sales by food system as well, 2000 to 2014. So here we've got kind of different stages of development, different regions, industrial, mixed regions, transitioning countries here. And actually look at this here in terms of retail sales, a 14% increase in frozen foods in countries that are in transition, fall in baked goods, significant rises in savory snacks and ready meals. And so, yeah, we certainly see these quite significant changes in terms of retail of food. We've already picked up, haven't we, about the changing animal availability of animal-based foods. And this really shows a global picture, doesn't it? Look, most regions of the world expected to see increases in animal-based foods between 1960 and 2050. And just want to pick up there on China's huge population, which has seen such significant increases in meat consumption. Very evident. So there are positives, though, to these changes. So these graphs here are really quite interesting. They show national diets have become more diverse. So quantities, food weight increasing, fat increasing, protein increasing, total calorie intake increasing over time. So we're seeing a greater diversity in food consumption globally. National diets have become more balanced across countries too. So perhaps each particular crop type being no dominant crop type showing up as much. And then the most dominant foods in national diets have become less important. So traditional foods, staple commodities have fallen in their dominance. It talks here, look, the proportion of countries' food supplies comprised of the most abundant crop commodity has declined on average. Particularly notable reductions in originally very high levels of dominance were visible in rice in contribution to calories in Southeast Asia, coconut for fat in Pacific Island countries, and groundnut for fat in Central African countries. So these staple foods, these dominant traditional foods, becoming less dominant. And so national diets have become more similar worldwide. So as countries have transitioned and adopted foods part of the global supply of food, their traditional diets reduce and their consumption of more globalized food sources and food types increase. And so we're seeing an increasing homogeneous landscape in terms of diets. And of course, the transitioning middle-income countries are those countries that have moved faster into that global supply chain